Jake Thompson had everything he ever wanted: a successful career as a marketing executive, a sprawling house in the suburbs, and most importantly, Emily, his wife of 7 years. To Jake, Emily was his anchor, his partner in crime, and the love of his life. She had a way of lighting up any room she entered, her laughter contagious and her beauty timeless. He often told himself that she was the best decision he had ever made. Their life was idyllic, or at least it seemed that way. Friends envied their bond, colleagues called them couple goals, and Jake basked in the pride of building a life with Emily. He ignored the fleeting moments of tension, the silences that stretched a little too long during dinner, or the way her phone seemed to buzz incessantly late into the night. Love, he thought, meant trust, and trust meant looking past the little things. But as the weeks went by, Jake couldn't ignore a subtle shift in their dynamic. Emily became distant, spending more time working late or out with her friends. Her laughter, once so free and genuine, seemed forced. And the intimacy they shared, both emotional and physical, had dwindled into something he could barely recognize. Jake brushed it off at first. Stress, he reasoned. Everyone goes through phases. But doubt has a way of creeping in, no matter how much you try to push it away. The shift in Emily's behavior gnawed at Jake like a splinter buried under the skin. He told himself to be rational, to avoid overreacting, but the small inconsistencies in her actions began to accumulate, forming a larger, darker picture he couldn't ignore. Every giggle at her phone, every vague excuse about work or last-minute plans, drove a wedge between his heart and his instincts. The Emily he once knew seemed to be slipping away, replaced by someone he couldn't quite recognize. One night, Jake decided to test the waters. Over dinner, he brought up a weekend getaway he'd been planning, a chance to reignite their connection. He described the charming cabin he'd rented, the hiking trails, the quiet, and the time to just be. Emily's reaction wasn't what he'd hoped for. "That sounds nice," she said, her eyes darting down to her plate. She swirled her fork around her pasta without taking a bite. "Nice?" Jake pressed, forcing a smile. "I thought you loved the mountains." "I do. It's just, I don't know if I can take the time off work right now. Things have been crazy, and I'd hate to leave Megan hanging." There it was again, Megan. Emily's coworker and supposedly close friend, though Jake had never actually met her. The mention of her name triggered a warning bell in his mind, one he tried to ignore for the sake of peace. "It's just a weekend," he countered gently. "I think Megan can handle things without you for 2 days." Emily shrugged, offering a noncommittal smile. "We'll see." But Jake knew she wasn't going to say yes. Her hesitation felt like a rejection, not just of the trip but of him. That weekend, Emily was busy with work, leaving Jake alone in their quiet house. He busied himself with chores, trying to drown out the nagging voice in his head. But every time he passed the living room, he caught sight of her laptop sitting on the coffee table, as if daring him to open it. Jake wasn't a snoop by nature. He valued trust in a relationship. But trust, he reasoned, had to be earned, and Emily's recent behavior wasn't exactly confidence-inspiring. After several minutes of internal debate, he sat down, opened the laptop, and clicked on her email. Most of it was mundane: work emails, online shopping receipts, and a newsletter about yoga retreats. But then he noticed an exchange with an unfamiliar name, AL. The subject line read, "Can't wait." Jake hesitated, his pulse quickening. He clicked it. Inside was a brief, cryptic message. "Friday at 8? Same place as last time?" Jake's stomach twisted. He scrolled further, finding more messages from the same sender. Most were casual, almost professional in tone, but there were hints of something deeper, a private connection hidden between the lines. He tried to convince himself it was innocent. Maybe El was just a colleague or an old friend. But why hadn't Emily mentioned them? The guilt of invading her privacy ate at him, and he closed the laptop. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing fast. 2 days later, Jake's suspicions deepened. Emily had gone out for a late meeting, and Jake decided to call her, hoping to catch her off guard. "Hey," she answered, her voice chipper, but with an edge of impatience. "What's up?" "Just checking in," Jake said casually. "You still at the office?" "Yeah, just wrapping up. It's been a long day." "Really? I thought you'd be done by now. What's Megan up to?" There was a pause, a beat too long. "Oh, she left a while ago. I stayed back to finish some reports." Jake clenched his jaw. He wanted to believe her, but her tone betrayed her. There was something she wasn't saying. "All right," he replied, masking his doubt. "Don't work too hard." When she hung up, Jake's mind was already racing. If she wasn't at the office, then where was she? And more importantly, who was she with? Jake's next clue came unexpectedly. A few days later, he was cleaning out his car when he found a crumpled receipt in the passenger seat. It wasn't his. It was from a high-end restaurant downtown, dated the same night Emily had claimed to be working late. Curiosity turned to unease as he stared at the receipt. The restaurant was a place they'd only been to on special occasions. Why hadn't she mentioned going there? And who had she gone with? That evening, Jake brought it up casually, testing her reaction. "I was thinking we should try that French place downtown again sometime," he said over dinner. "You know, the one with the amazing truffle pasta." Emily froze for a split second before nodding. "Oh, definitely. It's been ages since we went there." Jake's heart sank. She was lying. He could see it in her eyes. By now, Jake felt like he was living in a thriller novel, constantly piecing together fragments of a puzzle he didn't want to solve. He started paying closer attention. Subtle changes in Emily's routines, the way she'd lock her phone the moment he entered the room, or how she'd casually mention new friends from work he'd never heard of before. One night, as Emily showered, Jake made his boldest move yet. He unlocked her phone using the passcode he'd memorized over months of watching her. His hands trembled as he scrolled through her messages, his heart pounding with every swipe. Most of her conversations were innocent, chats with friends and colleagues. But then he found a thread with someone labeled Alex. The messages were brief but flirty, filled with inside jokes and casual references to meeting up. Jake's chest tightened. He wanted to throw the phone, to confront her right then and there. But he also knew he needed more. He couldn't accuse her based on gut feelings and a few suspicious messages. The following weekend, Jake decided to take things a step further. He installed a tracking app on Emily's phone, a decision that made him feel sick to his stomach. He hated invading her privacy, but he couldn't keep living with the uncertainty. That night, Emily told him she was going out with friends. Jake smiled, pretending not to care, but as soon as she left, he opened the tracking app. He watched as her location shifted from their neighborhood to the downtown area, right to the doorstep of the French restaurant. Jake grabbed his jacket and keys, his heart racing. He was done waiting for answers. It was time to find the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Jake's world had become an unsettling mix of monotony and dread. By day, he forced himself into the motions of normalcy, meetings, calls, dinners with Emily. By night, he pored over the details Frank had shared with him. The photos haunted him, not just because of the evidence they contained, but because of what they suggested, that Emily was slipping into a life Jake didn't recognize, a life he might not be able to pull her back from. One evening, Jake returned home to find Emily in the kitchen, humming softly as she chopped vegetables. She greeted him with a warm smile, her eyes lighting up as if nothing was wrong. The sight of her hit him like a punch to the gut. How could someone live such a double life so effortlessly? "Long day?" she asked, handing him a glass of wine. "Yeah," Jake replied, his voice heavy. "Yours?" She hesitated, her knife pausing mid-chop. "Same as always. Just meetings and more meetings. I'm starting to think my boss doesn't know what a work-life balance is." Her tone was light, teasing, but Jake couldn't help but scrutinize her every word, every gesture. Was she lying? Was this just another layer of her deception? Or was he overthinking everything? The paranoia was eating away at him, making him question even the most mundane details of their lives. Later that night, as Emily slept beside him, Jake stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He couldn't keep living like this, trapped between doubt and denial. He needed to know the full story, no matter how painful it might be. The next day, Jake decided to take matters into his own hands. He had already hired Frank to track Emily's movements, but now he wanted to see things for himself. If Emily was meeting this man again, Jake needed to be there to witness it. That evening, Emily left for yet another work dinner, her excuse growing thinner with each repetition. Jake waited 10 minutes before grabbing his coat and keys, then followed her, his heart pounding with every turn of the wheel. He kept a safe distance, his headlights dimmed, as he trailed her car through the city streets. Emily pulled into a small, upscale restaurant on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that catered to people who wanted privacy. Jake parked a block away and walked toward the restaurant, keeping to the shadows. Through the large front windows, he spotted her almost immediately, seated at a corner table with the man from the photos. They were leaning in close, their body language intimate, their conversation animated. Jake's stomach churned. He wanted to burst through the doors, to confront them both right then and there, but he knew it wasn't the right time. Instead, he slipped into a booth near the back, where he could watch without being noticed. He ordered a drink he didn't touch, his eyes fixed on Emily and her companion. For an hour, he watched as they laughed, whispered, and exchanged glances that made his blood boil. At one point, the man reached across the table and placed his hand over Emily's. She didn't pull away. As they left the restaurant, Jake followed them again, his pulse racing. This time, they didn't head to a hotel or an apartment. Instead, they drove to an industrial warehouse on the edge of town, a sprawling complex surrounded by high fences and security cameras. Jake parked at a distance and watched as Emily and the man disappeared inside. Frank's words echoed in his mind. "This guy is trouble. Money laundering, gambling rings, you name it." Jake's suspicions were no longer just about infidelity. They were about danger. What was Emily doing here? Was she just a pawn in this man's schemes? Or was she a willing participant? Jake waited for over an hour, his fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel. Finally, the warehouse door opened, and Emily and the man emerged, flanked by two other men in dark suits. They were carrying briefcases, their expressions serious. Jake took out his phone and snapped a few photos, his hand shaking. As Emily got into her car and drove off, Jake stayed behind, watching as the other men re-entered the warehouse. He debated whether to call Frank or the police, but something held him back. He needed to understand the full picture before he acted. The next morning, Jake met with Frank to go over the new information. Frank examined the photos Jake had taken, his expression grim. "This isn't just some side hustle," Frank said, leaning back in his chair. "These guys are big players. That warehouse? It's a front. They're laundering millions through shell companies. Your wife, she's in deep." Jake ran a hand through his hair, his frustration boiling over. "I don't understand. Emily isn't like this. She's not a criminal. She's involved somehow," Frank replied. Whether she's in it for the money, the thrill, or something else, I can't say. But she's not just an innocent bystander. Jake felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. This was bigger than he had imagined, and the stakes were higher than he was prepared for. If Emily was tied to this operation, it wasn't just their marriage at risk, it was her freedom, her safety. That night, Jake confronted Emily, though he kept his questions vague, testing her reaction. "How was your dinner?" he asked casually as they sat in the living room. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "Fine. Just the usual boring work stuff." Jake nodded, his heart sinking. She was lying again, and now he knew it for certain. But as he looked at her, he felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, sadness, maybe, or regret. He still loved her, despite everything. And that love made what he had to do next even harder. Jake knew he couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a web of lies. He had to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. But first, he needed one final piece of evidence, something that would force Emily to reveal her secrets, to explain why she had turned their lives upside down. As he lay awake that night, Jake resolved to see this through to the end. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. For days, Jake agonized over the photo. He wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, but deep down, he knew better. Emily had lied to him, and now he had proof. Still, he couldn't bring himself to confront her outright. What if he was wrong? What if this was all a misunderstanding? Instead, he tried to gather more evidence. He checked her phone when she wasn't looking, but it was always locked. He went through their credit card statements and found charges for places he didn't recognize: restaurants, boutiques, even a hotel. One evening, as Emily was getting ready for another work dinner, Jake's frustration boiled over. "Do you love me, Em?" he asked suddenly, his voice trembling. She turned to him, surprised. "Of course I do, Jake. Why would you even ask that?" "I don't know," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You've just been distant lately. I feel like we're not as close as we used to be." Emily walked over and placed a hand on his cheek, her expression soft. "I know I've been distracted. Work's been crazy. But I promise there's nothing to worry about." Her words were soothing, but they didn't match her actions. And Jake couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. The following week, Jake's world teetered on the edge of collapse. Sleep had become a distant memory, and his appetite was gone. He was operating on pure adrenaline, consumed by the need to uncover the truth. But for all his effort, Emily continued to evade him, her deception as seamless as her outward charm. Jake had grown used to her excuses. Late meetings, sudden errands, phone calls she stepped away to take, it all painted a grim picture. Yet every time he tried to pin down her lies, she slipped through his grasp, leaving him more frustrated and heartbroken than before. It was on a Tuesday evening when things finally began to unravel. Jake returned home earlier than usual, hoping to catch Emily off guard. As he entered their apartment, he noticed her purse and jacket tossed on the couch. She was home, but the place was unusually quiet. "Emily?" he called, his voice echoing through the silence. There was no answer. Jake's stomach twisted with unease as he made his way down the hall to their bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and as he approached, he heard muffled voices coming from inside. He froze, straining to make out the words. "I can't keep doing this," Emily's voice said, her tone low and urgent. "You don't have a choice," came a man's voice, one Jake didn't recognize. "You're in too deep. We both are." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he pressed his ear to the door. The conversation was muffled, but he caught snippets, something about money, risks, and a meeting set for Friday night. He backed away from the door, his mind racing. Emily wasn't just cheating, she was involved in something far more dangerous than he had imagined. The weight of it hit him like a freight train. He needed to confront her, but not yet. Not until he had the evidence to force her hand. The next morning, Jake contacted Frank. "I need you to find out everything you can about this meeting on Friday. Where it's happening, who'll be there, everything." Frank sighed. "Jake, you're playing with fire. If these people are as dangerous as they seem, you're putting yourself in real danger." "I don't care," Jake said firmly. "I have to know." Frank agreed, though reluctantly, and promised to get back to him as soon as possible. In the meantime, Jake tried to act normal around Emily, even as his anger and heartbreak threatened to consume him. That evening, Emily came home late, her face flushed and her excuses flimsy. Jake sat on the couch, pretending to read, but his eyes tracked her every move. "Long day?" he asked casually. "Yeah," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "I had to cover for someone at work." Jake nodded, biting back the urge to call her out. Instead, he waited until she went to bed, then searched through her things. He found her phone in her purse, but it was locked. Frustrated, he put it back and continued searching. In the back pocket of her purse, he found a crumpled piece of paper. It was a note, hastily scrawled, Friday, 10 p.m. .32. Jake's blood ran cold. Whatever was happening, it was going down in just 2 days. On Friday night, Jake followed Emily again, his nerves frayed as he trailed her car to the docks. The area was deserted, the air heavy with the smell of salt and diesel. Emily parked her car near a warehouse, then got out and approached a group of men standing near the entrance. Jake parked at a distance and watched as she greeted them, her posture tense. The man from the restaurant was there, along with 2 others. They exchanged briefcases, their conversation too far away for Jake to hear. Jake's heart pounded as he reached for his phone and snapped a few photos. Suddenly, one of the men turned and looked directly at him. Jake ducked down, his breath caught in his throat. "Did he see me?" Jake whispered to himself, his hands trembling. When he looked up again, the men were gone, and Emily was heading back to her car. Jake waited until she drove off before following her home, his mind racing. Back at the apartment, Jake confronted Emily. "I know where you were tonight," he said, his voice trembling with anger. Emily froze, her face pale. "What are you talking about?" "Don't lie to me," Jake snapped. "I followed you to the docks. I saw everything." For a moment, Emily said nothing. Then, her expression hardened. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "Then explain it to me," Jake demanded. "Tell me why you've been lying to me. Tell me who those men are, and what you're involved in." Emily's shoulders sagged, and she sat down on the couch. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was desperate. We were desperate." Jake frowned. "Desperate for what?" "For money," Emily said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I got in over my head. Those men, they offered me a way out." Jake stared at her, his anger giving way to a mixture of confusion and heartbreak. "A way out of what, Emily? We don't need their money. We're fine." "No, Jake," she said, shaking her head. "You're fine. Your business is thriving. But me? I've been drowning. The stress, the pressure, it was too much. I thought I could handle it, but I couldn't." Jake sat down beside her, his mind spinning. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want you to see me as weak," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want you to know how much I was struggling." Jake felt a surge of guilt. He had been so focused on his own success that he hadn't noticed Emily's pain. But at the same time, he couldn't forgive the lies or the danger she had put them both in. I don't know if I can fix this, he said finally, his voice breaking. Emily looked at him, her eyes pleading. I'll do whatever it takes, she said. I'll cut ties with him. I'll come clean. Just don't give up on me. Jake said nothing, his heart torn between love and betrayal. He knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain, but one thing was clear: their lives would never be the same. Jake's world shattered in that moment, but he didn't explode. He didn't yell or cry. Instead, he simply walked out into the rain, his mind racing. He knew now that his marriage was over, but what hurt the most wasn't Emily's betrayal. It was the realization that he had ignored the signs for so long. But the story didn't end there. 2 weeks later, Jake received an anonymous email with a series of photos attached. They showed Emily and the man in compromising positions, but there was more. The photos also included a third person, Jake's best friend, Ryan. The email's subject line read, "Thought you should know the whole truth." As Jake stared at the photos, his anger gave way to something darker. The betrayal ran deeper than he'd imagined. Emily hadn't just cheated, she'd orchestrated a web of lies that included the people he trusted most. And now, Jake had a choice: to let it destroy him or to use it as fuel to rebuild his life. In the end, Jake chose the latter. He filed for divorce, cut ties with Ryan, and focused on building a new future. But the scars remained, a constant reminder that even the most picture-perfect love can hide the darkest secrets.